The old stone gate creaked softly as Thomas Reed pushed it open at exactly 6 a.m., just as he had done every morning for the past 11 years. Oakwood Cemetery spread before him like a city of silence. 300 acres of rolling hills, ancient oak trees, and row after row of marble and granite markers, each one a story finished, a life reduced to dates and brief epitaphs. At 73 years old, Thomas moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to respect his body's limitations while refusing to surrender to them. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of work he rarely spoke about, carried a rake and a canvas bag of tools. His face, deeply lined and perpetually thoughtful, bore the expression of a man who had made peace with difficult truths. The morning mist clung to the ground, softening the edges of headstones and making the cemetery feel even more removed from the world beyond its walls. Thomas preferred these early hours, before visitors arrived with their flowers and their grief, before he had to witness the fresh pain of loss that he understood all too well. He was a caretaker, the keeper of this quiet place. And for 11 years, most people who encountered him here assumed that was all he was, a simple groundskeeper who raked leaves, cleaned monuments, and maintained eternal homes of the dead. They never asked about the way he sometimes paused at certain graves, his hand resting gently on a headstone, as if greeting an old friend. They never noticed how he seemed to know exactly which families were struggling most with their grief, or how he had an uncanny ability to appear at just the right moment when someone needed a kind word or a moment of silent companionship. They certainly never asked about his past, about the credentials he had left behind, about the office he had walked away from, or about the reason a man with 3 decades of professional experience helping people process trauma and loss had chosen to spend his final years among the dead rather than the living. Thomas began his rounds of the oldest section of the cemetery, where weathered stones dated back to the 1800s and the names had been worn smooth by more than a century of rain and wind. He moved methodically, checking for fallen branches, clearing debris, ensuring that even the oldest and most forgotten graves maintained their dignity. "Morning, Eleanor," he said softly, pausing at a small headstone marked 1847 to 1891. "Looks like that storm knocked some acorns onto your spot. Let's clean that up for you." He had names for many of them, these permanent residents of Oakwood. Not their real names necessarily, though he had read every stone, every inscription, every beloved mother and devoted husband, but the names he had given them in the running conversation he maintained with the silent dead. It wasn't madness, this habit of speaking to those who couldn't answer. It was companionship. And after 11 years of living in the small cottage at the cemetery's edge, after 11 years of choosing the company of the deceased over the complications of the living, Thomas had come to understand that the dead were often better listeners than those still drawing breath. By 8 a.m., he had made it to the newer sections, where the grass was still settling over recent burials and the flowers were fresh rather than faded. This was the part of the cemetery that hurt more, where the dates were recent enough to feel immediate, where you could see a life cut short, 1995 to 2024, just 29 years, and feel the waste of it. He was kneeling beside a grave, carefully trimming the grass around the edges of a new headstone, when he heard the sound that didn't belong in the morning quiet. A car door slamming, followed by footsteps moving too fast, too urgent for a typical visitor. Thomas looked up to see a young woman, perhaps 30 years old, walking quickly down one of the paths, her movements jerky and distressed. She wore jeans and an oversized sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back carelessly. Even from a distance, Thomas could read the language of her body. This was someone carrying an enormous weight. She stopped at a grave in Section C, a newer burial, and stood there rigidly, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding something in. Thomas returned to his work, giving her privacy, but kept her in his peripheral vision. After 40 years as a grief counselor, he had learned to recognize the signs of someone on the edge. 5 minutes passed. The woman didn't move. She didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't kneel. She just stood there, frozen, as if approaching the grave would make the death too real. Thomas finished his trimming, gathered his tools, and began walking slowly in her direction, not directly toward her but on a path that would bring him nearby. He had learned that the direct approach often scared people away, but proximity sometimes gave them permission to speak if they needed to. As he passed within 20 feet of her, she turned suddenly. "Do you work here?" Her voice was tight, controlled to the point of breaking. "I do," Thomas said gently, stopping but not moving closer. "I'm the caretaker. Thomas Reed. How long have you worked here?" 11 years. She looked back at the grave, then at him again. Do you ever think about what it means? All of this." She gestured at the cemetery around them. All these people, gone, just ended. Thomas recognized the question beneath the question. This wasn't idle philosophy. This was someone trying to make sense of something that made no sense. "Every day," he said honestly. "Would you like to talk about it?" "I don't even know you. Sometimes that makes it easier." She studied him for a long moment. This old man in work clothes with kind eyes and no judgment visible in his weathered face. Then something in her collapsed slightly, the rigid control giving way to exhaustion. "My brother," she said, nodding toward the grave. "Michael. He was 28. Car accident. 6 weeks ago." "I'm very sorry," Thomas said, and meant it with the depth of someone who understood that those words, though inadequate, were still necessary. "Everyone keeps telling me it'll get better," she said, her voice rising slightly. "That time heals. That I'll find peace. That he's in a better place." She laughed bitterly. "But he's not in a better place. He's in the ground. He's gone. And I can't figure out how I'm supposed to just keep living when he doesn't get to." Thomas had heard variations of this speech hundreds of times before, in his old office with its comfortable chairs and its box of tissues and its carefully chosen artwork meant to be soothing. But he had also learned that grief didn't care about comfortable offices or professional credentials. Grief showed up everywhere, including cemetery paths at 8:30 in the morning. "What was your brother like?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. "What?" "Michael. What was he like? What did he love? What made him laugh?" Her eyes filled with tears for the first time. He was funny. Really funny. He could make jokes about anything, even when things were terrible. He used to say that life was too short to spend it being serious. She laughed sadly. "Turns out he was right about that, at least." "Sounds like someone worth knowing," Thomas said. "He was the best person I knew." The tears were falling now, and she didn't try to stop them. "And it's not fair. It's not fair that drunk drivers get to walk away from accidents and my brother, who never hurt anyone, who was driving home from volunteering in an animal shelter, doesn't get to have a future, doesn't get to fall in love, have kids, grow old. How is that fair?" "It's not," Thomas said simply. "There's no fairness in it. And anyone who tells you there is, anyone who tries to explain it as part of some grand plan, is lying to make themselves feel better about a universe that allows good people to die young." She looked at him sharply, surprised by the honesty. "But," Thomas continued, "unfairness doesn't mean meaninglessness. Your brother's life mattered. Matters. Present tense. Because he changed you, shaped you, made you who you are. That doesn't disappear just because he did." "Then why does it feel like I disappeared too?" she asked quietly. "Like part of me died with him?" "Because part of you did," Thomas said. "The part that existed in relationship to him. The sister self that only came alive in his presence. That version of you can't exist anymore without him here. That's what grief is. It's not just missing someone. It's mourning all the versions of yourself that needed them to exist." The woman stared at him, something shifting in her expression. "You're not just a groundskeeper, are you?" Thomas smiled slightly. "I am a groundskeeper. I keep these grounds. I care for these graves. That's real work, important work. But you were something else before. I was a grief counselor for 33 years. Specialized in traumatic loss, sudden death, complicated grief. I had an office downtown, a full schedule, professional credentials." He paused. "And one day, I walked away from all of it." "Why?" Thomas looked around at the cemetery, at the hundreds of stories ended and remembered here. "Because I spent 33 years helping people process loss, and I was good at it. Really good. I could give them frameworks for understanding their grief, techniques for managing it, perspective for contextualizing it. But you know what I couldn't give them?" She waited. Permission to just sit with it, to be broken for as long as they needed to be broken. Because in my office, There was always an agenda, progress, healing, closure. But here, he gestured at the cemetery. Here there's no agenda. Here, grief is just allowed to exist. And sometimes that's more helpful than all the professional interventions in the world. So you just quit being a therapist to rake leaves in a graveyard? I quit being a professional grief manager to become a witness to grief. There's a difference. The woman was quiet for a long moment, looking at her brother's grave. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. How to keep living. It feels impossible. It is impossible, Thomas said, and you'll do it anyway. That's the terrible miracle of human resilience. We survive things that should destroy us. I don't want to survive it. I want him back. I know, and that wanting never really goes away. It just becomes something you learn to carry. Have you lost someone? Thomas's expression changed, something old and deep moving across his weathered features. Yes. Who? He hesitated, then said, My wife, Sarah, 32 years of marriage. She died from cancer after fighting it for 3 years. I watched her suffer, watched her diminish, watched her leave me one small piece at a time before she finally left completely. I'm sorry, the woman said, and Thomas heard his own words echoed back to him, understood that they were inadequate and necessary in exactly the same measure. I was a grief counselor, Thomas continued. I had spent decades helping people navigate loss. And when it was my turn, all that professional knowledge meant nothing. I was just as broken as anyone else. Maybe more so, because I kept thinking I should know how to fix this, how to process it correctly. But there is no correct. There's just endurance. Is that why you came here? To the cemetery? Partly. After Sarah died, I couldn't go back to the office. Couldn't sit in that chair and tell people about healing when I felt like I'd never heal. Couldn't offer hope when I had none. So I sold the practice, sold our house, twofold her absence, and I found this place. The caretaker position had just opened up, and it came with a cottage, and I thought maybe if I couldn't be with Sarah, I could at least be somewhere that honored the end of things rather than pretending death could be neatly processed and overcome. That's incredibly sad, the woman said softly. Or incredibly honest, Thomas replied. I spent 3 decades teaching people to move through their grief, but Sarah's death taught me that sometimes you don't move through grief. You just move with it. It becomes part of your landscape. Like these headstones are part of this land. Always there, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background, but never really gone. The woman looked at him with new understanding. Do you think you'll ever leave here? I don't know. This place has given me something I couldn't find anywhere else. What's that? Permission to be still, to stop trying to fix things or understand things or make meaning out of things, to just tend. These graves, this ground, this silence. It's enough. They stood together quietly for a moment, this young woman and this old man, both carrying losses that would never fully leave them. Finally, she said, I should probably go. I couldn't face going to work today. Couldn't pretend to be normal. So I came here instead. You're allowed to not be normal, Thomas said. You're allowed to be exactly as broken as you are. My therapist says I need to find ways to honor Michael's memory while also learning to let go. Your therapist is doing their job, trying to move you toward healing. But there's no timetable for this. Honor his memory however feels right to you. And if you never let go, if you carry it with you forever, that's allowed too. The woman's eyes filled again. Thank you. I don't know why, but talking to you helped more than 6 weeks of grief counseling. Thomas smiled gently. Sometimes the most helpful thing is someone who's not trying to help, who's just willing to stand in the pain with you without trying to make it smaller or more manageable. She nodded, then impulsively moved forward and hugged him. Brief, fierce, the embrace of someone who desperately needed human contact, but couldn't sustain it for long. Thomas returned the hug gently, this stranger who had trusted him with her broken heart. As she walked back to her car, Thomas returned to his work, but the conversation stayed with him. It always did. These unexpected moments when his past life intersected with his present one, when the credentials he left behind still served a purpose, even if that purpose looked different now. Over the following weeks, the woman returned. Not every day, but regularly. Sometimes she would find Thomas and talk. Sometimes she would just sit by her brother's grave while Thomas worked nearby, his presence a silent permission for her grief. He never pushed, never counseled in the formal sense, but he listened, and in listening, he offered what he had come to understand was the most valuable thing: witness. One morning, about 2 months after their first conversation, she found him tending a grave in the older section. "Thomas," she said, and he turned to find her looking somehow lighter, though no less sad. "I wanted to tell you, I'm going back to work next week. Trying to, anyway. How do you feel about that?" "Terrified. But also, I think I'm ready to try. Not to move on. I don't think I'll ever move on. But to move forward. With him. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. I wanted to thank you. For these weeks. For not trying to fix me." "You were never broken," Thomas said. "You were grieving. Those are different things." She smiled. Something genuine beneath the sadness. "I'm going to keep coming here. To visit Michael. Is that okay? This is your brother's resting place. You're always welcome here. I meant, is it okay if I say hello when I see you? If we talk sometimes?" "I'd like that," Thomas said honestly. After she left, Thomas stood among the graves and thought about the strange circular nature of things. He had come here to hide from the work that had defined him, to escape the pressure of professional healing. But the work had found him anyway, in a different form. Not in an office with appointments and frameworks, but in morning conversations and silent companionship, in the honest acknowledgement that some losses can never be made whole. That afternoon, as he was trimming hedges near the cemetery's chapel, he saw another visitor, a middle-aged man sitting on a bench near a small grave marked with a child's name. The man's posture was familiar, shoulders hunched, head down, the body language of someone carrying unbearable weight. Thomas had seen this man before, visiting this grave every Sunday for the past 3 years. He had never approached him, respecting the privacy of grief. But today, something made him pause. He walked over slowly, giving the man time to wave him off if he wanted to be alone. When no dismissal came, Thomas sat on the other end of the bench, not speaking, just sitting in companionable silence. After several minutes, the man said quietly, "My daughter, Lily, she would have been 10 next week." "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "Everyone says that. I'm sorry, like it's their fault, like sorry means anything." "You're right. It doesn't mean anything. There aren't words that mean anything for this." The man looked at him, surprised by the agreement rather than the usual platitudes. "But we still say it," Thomas continued, "because the alternative is silence, and silence feels like not caring, even though sometimes silence is more honest than words. Are you a therapist or something?" "I was. Long time ago. Now I'm just a caretaker." "You talk like a therapist." "Old habits. Sorry." Thomas smiled slightly. "There I go, saying sorry when it doesn't mean anything." The man almost smiled. Almost. They sat together for a while longer. Then the man stood to leave. But before he walked away, he said, "Same time next week?" "I'll be here," Thomas said. And he was. The following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, the man whose name Thomas eventually learned was David began arriving earlier, and they would sit together on that bench, sometimes talking, sometimes not, but always there, present in the pain. Others noticed. A widow who came every day to her husband's grave started bringing extra coffee, 1 cup for her and 1 for Thomas, which they would drink together while she told stories about her 52-year marriage. A young father, visiting the grave of a stillborn daughter, began seeking Thomas out to ask him possible questions about meaning and purpose, questions Thomas answered with honesty rather than comfort. Slowly, without planning it or wanting it, Thomas found himself doing the work again, but without the office, without the credentials, without the professional distance that had once felt so necessary. This was something raw, more real. This was grief met directly, without the buffer of therapeutic frameworks. One evening, As the sun set and cast long shadows across the cemetery, Thomas was locking the main gate when he saw someone standing by Sarah's grave. He had buried her here, in this place that had become his home, and he visited her every evening before going back to the cottage. The figure was a young woman, perhaps 25, and she was placing flowers on Sarah's grave, fresh roses, carefully arranged. Thomas approached slowly, confused. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Can I help you?" The young woman turned, her eyes red from crying. "Are you Thomas?" Thomas Reed. I'm Amanda Martinez. I don't know if you remember me. It was 15 years ago. I was 13. My mom had just died in a car accident, and my dad brought me to see you. You were my therapist for about 2 years. Thomas studied her face, and slowly the memory came back. A broken girl who had lost her mother and couldn't speak about it, who had sat in his office week after week, slowly learning to carry her grief. "Amanda," he said softly. "Yes, I remember. You've grown up. You saved my life," she said simply. "I was so lost back then, so angry and broken. And you didn't try to fix me. You just helped me understand that what I was feeling was okay, that I was allowed to be broken." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I'm glad I could help. When I heard you'd left practice, I tracked you down. I wanted to thank you. But when I found you were working here, I wasn't sure if you want to be found. Then I saw the grave, Sarah Reed, and I realized you lost someone too. My wife, 11 years ago. I'm so sorry." Amanda gestured at the flowers she'd placed. "Is it okay that I left these? I wanted to honor her somehow, to thank her for sharing you with people like me who needed you." "It's more than okay," Thomas said, deeply moved. "Thank you." They stood together by Sarah's grave as the last light faded from the sky. "Can I ask you something?" Amanda said. "Why here? Why did you become a caretaker instead of continuing therapy?" Thomas considered the question, the same one he'd asked himself 1,000 times. "Because," he said finally, "I spent 33 years helping people find meaning in loss. But when Sarah died, I couldn't find any meaning. I just found loss. And I realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe not everything needs to mean something. Maybe sometimes death is just death, and grief is just grief, and the only response is to acknowledge it and keep living anyway." That's actually beautiful," Amanda said. "In a terrible way. Most true things are," Thomas said. Amanda visited a few more times over the following months, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just talking. Through her, other former clients began to find him, people whose lives he had touched years ago, who came to the cemetery not to visit their dead, but to see the man who had helped them survive their grief. And Thomas, who had come here to hide from his calling, slowly began to understand that there was no hiding from it. The work of witnessing grief, of sitting with pain, of acknowledging loss, that work followed him because it was who he was, not just what he did. One morning, almost exactly 11 years after he had arrived at Oakwood Cemetery, Thomas was approached by the cemetery director, a kind woman named Margaret who had always given him space to do his work without interference. "Thomas," she said, "I want to let you know the city is funding a new program, grief support services in cemetery settings. They want to hire professionally trained counselors to be available to visitors, to offer informal support. They asked if I knew anyone qualified." She smiled. "I immediately thought of you." "I'm not sure I'm qualified anymore," Thomas said. "I've been out of practice for a long time." "You've been practicing every day," Margaret said gently, "just in a different way. The question is, would you want to make it official? You could keep your caretaker duties if you want, but you'd also be authorized to provide grief counseling right here, in this setting, without the constraints of traditional practice." Thomas looked around at the cemetery, at the graves he had tended, the visitors he had comforted, the ground that had become his sanctuary and his purpose. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course. There's no rush." That evening, Thomas sat by Sarah's grave as he did every night, talking to her the way he had for 11 years. "I came here to be done with that life," he told her, "to just exist in the quiet without the weight of other people's pain. But maybe the quiet was never about stopping the work. Maybe it was about learning to do the work differently, to do it honestly, without pretending I had answers I didn't have. The grave, of course, didn't answer. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, Thomas felt a kind of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The next day, he found Margaret and told her yes. Within months, Oakwood Cemetery became known as a place where grief was not just allowed but honored, where people could come not for professional therapy sessions, but for honest conversations about loss, where an old man who had once tried to escape his calling had instead redefined it. Thomas continued his rounds each morning, tending graves and maintaining the grounds. But now, he also spent hours each week sitting on benches with the bereaved, walking paths with the grieving, offering not solutions or frameworks, but simply presence, the recognition that some losses can never be fixed, only witnessed. People came from across the city, not just to visit their dead, but to talk to the caretaker who understood that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived with, who had learned, through his own shattering, that the most profound healing sometimes comes not from moving past pain, but from learning to move with it. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, 12 years after he had first arrived at Oakwood, Thomas stood by her grave with a small group that had gathered. Former clients, regular visitors, people whose lives had been touched by his willingness to simply sit with them in their darkness. "Thank you all for coming," he said softly. Sarah would have been surprised by this. I think. She always said I was better with the dead than the living. There was gentle laughter. But maybe that's what I needed to learn, that there's less difference between the two than we think. The dead remain in us, shaping us, continuing to matter. And the living carry loss with them always, learning to be whole people despite the holes grief carves in us. He paused, looking at the faces gathered around him, young and old, all bound by the common experience of surviving loss. "This cemetery taught me something I couldn't learn in any office or any textbook," Thomas continued. "It taught me that grief is not the opposite of love, but the proof of it, that to grieve deeply is to have loved deeply, and that the work of honoring our dead is inseparable from the work of remaining fully alive." As the gathering dispersed, Thomas remained by Sarah's grave, as he always did, an old man in a cemetery, tending both the ground beneath his feet and the griefs of those who walked upon it. He had come here 11 years ago broken and hiding, tried to escape the pain of loss and the weight of other people's grief. But the cemetery, this city of silence, this repository of stories ended and remembered, had taught him that you cannot escape grief. You can only learn to tend it, and in tending it, in others and in himself, Thomas Reed had found not healing. That word was too simple, too complete, but something perhaps more valuable, purpose. The ability to witness suffering without needing to solve it, the wisdom to know that some questions have no answers, and the courage to sit with those questions anyway. The old caretaker locked the cemetery gate that evening as the sun set, casting long shadows across the graves. Tomorrow he would return, as he had for 11 years, as he would for however many years remained to him, and he would do his work, tending the ground, cleaning the stones, and offering to those who grieve what he had finally learned to offer himself: the permission to be broken, the recognition that loss is permanent, and the quiet assurance that life continues anyway, carrying the dead with us like the earth carries these graves. Some people leave their mark on the world through grand gestures or notable achievements. Thomas Reed's mark was quieter, measured in conversations on cemetery benches, in tears witnessed without judgment, in grief acknowledged as valid and permanent and worthy of respect. The old therapist had become a caretaker, and in becoming a caretaker, he had become the therapist he was always meant to be, not one who offered solutions, but one who offered something far more rare and valuable: the willingness to stand in pain and call it by its true name without diminishment, without false comfort, without the pretense that some losses can ever be made whole. He was the keeper of the ground, the witness to grief, and in that role, more healer than he had ever been behind a desk.